Alright, hey, I'm going to be talking about Project 5 today and going over, using it as an overview. In the notes you're going to be looking at Project 5, where you're going to be taking your web page, the content from your zip file, and you're going to be breaking it down now into the core containers, the core containers. Then you're going to be breaking that main container into smaller and smaller and smaller containers. But now you're going to be taking containers, making small columns out of it, and you're going to be adding pseudo classes and classes, and you're going to be doing some really interesting things. So you're going to be breaking things down into your banner region, your navigation. Remember, we're using HTML5 semantic elements. We're using CSS that matches with that. So we have, of course, we're going to have our doc type of HTML5. We're going to have our Google Shiv. We're going to have all of those core things that we always have on every page. Then we're going to be breaking things down into container, banners. We'll have our navigation. We'll have our header. Then we're going to break down the content area into different columns, column 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those are going to be made so that they stack or float next to one another. As long as they're wide enough and they fit in that space, they'll float next to one another. Of course, we have our footer at the end. We close up our container, we close up our body page, and we're good to go. So if we were to look at this kind of thing, when you started out, be blocking these things in, but then we'll be changing some things as we go along. So what you're going to end up with is you're going to be using some of these little pictures, these little insect, little bug characters, and the page is going to look like this. You're going to have your banner, your header region with your navigation. You're going to have rollovers that when you roll over a section, a current link, it's going to become, it's going to change its state. It's going to change a color or change a background or something like that. We get our nice columns here that we can have. We got some navigations on the side, and we have our footer at the bottom. If we were to look at this as a live web page, it's going to look something like this. When I roll over my sections, I'm going to have my change of background state, so I'm going to add a change of background. I'm going to have highlights on the page where I actually highlight out a certain section of text, and I'm using a span attribute and we'll be using a span attribute and a class when we do that. So you're going to be picking out code. We're going to be organizing these columns up using the float attribute. We have another set of pseudo classes on the right hand side here. Pseudo classes are going to be what we use to change the navigation state. So when I roll over this, you can see it turns blue, and then down here we're going to have our footer and those kind of things. So if we were to look at this page, if we were to look at this page's code, you can see I've got my doc type, I've got my header and my HTML set, or my head region, where I've got my introduction, my title, I've got my Google Shiv, I've got my link to my CSS page, and I begin building my navigation and that sort of thing. So here's my container. Remember, I've got the beginning of my container. Since it's a div, I have to make the elements for me. So I have my main container here, and I have to make sure I close that container at the end. So everything has got a beginning and an end. Big containers, smaller containers, but you always have to have that opening and that closing tag. If you make a div, then that div has to be closed with a generic div tag. When you use HTML5 semantics, you use the core semantic tags for your closing and ending. So you make sure you have the opener and the closer flow. A nice example is the footer here. There's the footer, starts the footer, and it ends the footer. And everything within the footer is contained within that region. Another example of that is up here in our navigation. So here's the navigation, and here is the end of the navigation. Another example is the header. The beginning of the header, the end of the header. Well, that's what's nice about HTML5 is that you can see that in action. Now I'm going to go to the web page itself. Now you might not be aware of this, but you can actually look using a browser. I'm using Google Chrome. If I go up to the settings over on the right hand side and I go down into more tools and I go into developer tools, it's going to open up a little side panel here. This little side panel is going to allow me to actually isolate and look at regions of my page, and when I do that, it'll actually start to highlight it. So here's my this is the head region, which doesn't really highlight, so I'm going to close that. Now I go into the body and I begin looking at my containers. So if I go over here and I hit Control minus, I'll be able to look at my entire web page as one kind of shot. So here's when I hover over the container here, it shows me the container. When I hover over the banner, it shows me the banner. And it will actually, if I click on banner, it'll actually pull up the CSS for it and tell me the size and that sort of thing. If I go to my navigation, I can look at my navigation, and I can look at my lists, and I can look at what's inside of my list. So I can actually see each and every list as it is laid out here. And so that's really it's very nice to be able to look at. Here's my footer, here's my content. Now I break this into different columns. Column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. What's nice is I can look at my columns and I can see the actual code that is associated with it. So here in my on my page, if I went to the actual, so if I have my actual page here and I hit Control U, it's going to open up a source file page. So it'll open up the source file page, and I can see the style sheet here as well. And if I click on that and open that in a new tab, I can see my style sheet. I'm using an example here. And I can see all my CSS, my code for every single attribute, and that helps me to kind of know what's going on. And so this gives me a good idea of gives me the exact code that I'm looking at. So for any web page you go to, you can look at the content of it and you can see everything that was coded on it. So for instance, here's some of the things that we're looking at. Now in our notes for the class, we're looking at the span selector and pseudo classes. And so when we do this, we're going to be talking about how do we create a class, how do we use the class in the HTML, in the actual HTML document, and what is a pseudo class. A class is something that we can use over and over again, and we use that over and over again. It's a markup element, and like we were doing with divs, we have a pound sign. So we can use, instead of a pound sign, we're going to use a dot. So it's a two-part process. We create the class on our CSS, and then we go and mark up areas on our page. So for instance, we're using a highlight class in this example. So, and that's being used here to highlight this text. Well, in my CSS, I'll do it like this. So here's my web page. In the section that contains this information, the content, I'm using a span class of highlight to contain the text within this region. Sorry, I lost it. Span here. What I'm going to be doing is I start it here and I end it right there. So it has an opening span. The span is going to span a certain area. It has a class called highlight. Everything within the container is going to be between these two span attributes. Now the highlight attribute is a class. I have to go to my CSS for that, and I have made a dot highlight attribute in my CSS. So here's the dot highlight, or this is actually the class itself. So dot highlight is using this information to color that particular section. And what's nice about it is I can use it over and over and over again. I can use this class multiple times, whereas I can't use some of the other IDs multiple times when I use them. And so this makes it really, really nice. So I have a highlight attribute. So when I see this here, and if I go to my CSS over here, I can go to my content. Let's see, it's up in this area. My banner region, my navigation, and in my header, if I pull down my header here, let me see if I can find it. It's in my header. Turn to my container, and here's my span. So here's my span. If I click on it over here, you can see how it highlights in that section. So if I move, there's another one someplace, here's another one. So you're going to be adding spans using, well, you're going to be adding spans in your HTML. You'll add the class in your CSS. They work together, spans and classes. Another section is the hover state, or the different states of a navigation. When you hover over something, when it's a link, you want something to change, a color, its boldness, it gets underlined. In this particular case, we're using a hover state that changes a background. So in the navigation area, for the navigation, I'm going to be looking at my style sheet, and I'm going to be adding a state for a hover. This changes a color for certain things, but if I wanted it to be in a navigation region, so I can have links throughout my page, not necessarily the navigation link, but I can have navigation on the side, and I have navigation on the side here down at the bottom, these. So I have a color change here, and that's a hover state called hover, and then I have a hover state up here in my navigation. So the way that looks is I have a pseudo class. So for an anchor, when it's a link, it's this color. An anchor, when it's visited, that's a state after it's been visited. When you visit a link, it'll change its color so you can tell you've been there before. And an anchor, when it's hovered over, will change its color. Well, back here, I want an anchor that when it's hovered over and it's current, the current link, it'll change the background. And it also changes the background on whenever it's current and when it's hovered over. So the background can change. And so you're going to be taking that and changing, using the navigation here, navigation hover. So what it does is it makes sure that that image changes within a navigation, or within a link within a navigation. So you're going to be adding that sort of thing. You're also going to be using an attribute called float, where we float things. A float attribute will make something move to one side, right side, left, so that you can make these columns. So our actual columns are going to have an attribute that makes them float to the left. And when they float to the left, they're going to stack kind of in a row. Well, yeah, in a row. So you'll have a column. There'll be individual columns that stack up next to one another. And we use that attribute in our lower section of our page, in our CSS, to make sure that our columns that we're using in our content region, that our columns here, our column divisions, stack up next to one another. And so those are the kinds of things that you're going to be doing in your web pages for Project 5. It ends up being a very good looking web page, and one that you'll want to refer back to, because you